Alright, so we already discussed Spain in terms of the age of absolutism, so now we're going to go ahead and discuss France, which is pretty interesting, but it can be difficult to remember a lot of the stuff because almost every single person that we're going to be dealing with is named Louis. Go figure. We started off class by looking at a couple Bruce Almighty clips of him just getting all the power in the world. So again, we're dealing with this theme of power throughout the age of absolutism. Our do now had to do with power as well, based off of the Bruce Almighty clips. But then we also went in to talk about what would you do if you actually had the most powerful powers in the world? What would you do if you inherited godlike powers? And then what would you do if you weren't godlike, but you had the most power in a country? If you were a president, a dictator, monarch, whatever you want to call it. How would you try and keep your power? What kind of religion would you set up, if any? And what type of government would you have, assuming you can't have democracy? The connection that we're making, obviously, is still with absolute monarchies, and we're continuing that as we discuss France as well, because, again, we're still under the heading of Age of Absolutism. So France is going to have numerous rulers that we're going to talk about today, and as I referenced, it's going to be a lot of different Louis. Louis the 14th, Louis the 13th, Louis the 2nd, Louis the 4th, all these different Louis. And they all had different ideas on how to rule France, but yet they were all, for the most part, absolute in their power. They ran the country very differently from one another. They have different philosophies, but they still have all the power in the nation. But first, a little background. France undergoes a lot of wars of religions from the 1560s to 1590s. You really have the Catholic majority there against the French Protestant minority called Huguenots. It's a key word there. And they end up tearing France apart. You can see in the picture here that it's just an all-out slaughter. Again, Catholic was the majority of religious people in France, and so they were very much heated against the French Protestant minority called Huguenots. Ever since really the Protestant Reformation, it has a long-lasting effect for 50, 60, 70 years, and it never really goes away. And it kind of culminates in an event known as St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, and this is where Catholics slaughtered anywhere from 3,000 to even up to 20,000 Huguenots. Again, Huguenots, French Protestant minority. And this incident really symbolizes the complete breakdown of order, and it's going to slowly but surely push France towards the French Revolution. If any of you have ever read or seen the book and the movie Les Miserables, that takes place during the French Revolution. So a lot of those ideas that are encapsulated there were really beginning in this France's wars of religion and the age of absolutism. Some other background, you have Henry IV. Again, this IV Roman numeral is really 1 and a 5, but it's really 5 minus 1, which is 4. And Henry IV, he inherits the French throne, but he was a Huguenot prince, so that means he was Protestant, and Catholics aren't going to like that. Again, France was predominantly Catholic, and so he's going to be fighting against the Catholics for many, many years, but after a handful of those years, he decides to convert to Catholicism. A lot of people think that he was selling out, so to speak, during that time, but his argument was Paris is worth a mass, and that doesn't mean mass as in many, but it means mass as in Catholic Mass. In other words, Paris and France unifying the state together is more important than what religion I'm practicing, and really what religion anybody's practicing. But when he does this, he also enacts a legislation that protects Protestants. So even though he's trying to compromise and become Catholic and appease the Catholics, at the same time, he's also angering the Catholics because they also see him as a potential sellout. Yes, you converted to Catholicism, they'd say, but you also set this legislation up specifically for Protestants, and this legislation was called the Edict of Nantes. And this essentially granted Huguenots religious tolerance and freedoms, but you can't confuse that with just all-out freedom or all-out tolerance. They didn't. They could only have certain gatherings and certain church services on certain days in certain places and at certain times. It was by no means as tolerant as we'd want it to be or as free as they'd want it to be. And Henry IV really represents a new type of leader of the time called politique. It's spelled politique, but it's actually pronounced politique. And it essentially means political concerns should be placed over religion. And that's essentially what Henry IV did. He thought that unifying the state, Paris's worth of Mass, is more important than religion. And this idea really comes full circle later on. Then you have Louis XIII, again Roman numeral X, 111, so that's 10, 11, 12, 13. He's the sonnery of Henry IV, and he inherits the throne when he's only 9 years old. But of course, they're not going to give him the proverbial keys to the castle, so they're going to appoint somebody as a chief administrator, the person who's actually ruling. Apart from his mommy, it was Cardinal Richelieu, and he's really the guy who's in charge of the nation during this time, and his goals ultimately were to expand the central government, make the royal family stronger. Also, he wanted to destroy the Huguenots, get rid of the Protestants, and any nobles who did not support the royal family. And again, even this idea comes back later on too. Now, what about this Louis? XIV, so 10, 11, and 5. You'd think it's 16, but it's not, because this bigger number is towards the end. So you actually subtract the V and the I, so it would be Louis XIV. Now, as if the other Louis here wasn't good enough becoming prince at the age of 9, Louis XIV becomes king at age 5, and his chief minister was Cardinal Mazarin. Perhaps not as important as Cardinal Richelieu, and not as powerful, but nonetheless influential. Louis XIV grows up, and he decides to pick a different symbol for the royal family. At the time, the royal family symbol was a flower. It was a bunch of flowers. Now, imagine if your sports team was named the New York Flowers. Not exactly very intimidating, so he kind of recognized this as well. So he decides he wants to pick a different symbol to really show and reflect who he is as a king, and also reflect the royal family. So he picks the sun, and he becomes known as the Sun King. So a little key term for you there. He's also credited, whether or not he said it or not is another story, but he's credited as saying the following: I am the state. In other words, I am in control. I am the government. Again, this is the idea of the divine right of kings, as God appointed him for this position. So he actually wants to rule. He doesn't want to just leave things to his advisors. And his platform, so to speak, that he kind of runs on is one king, one law, and one faith. Now, what does he mean by this one king? Well, he wants to get the nobles in line. He constantly is going to have them come to his palace at Versailles, which was beautiful, because he kind of wanted to keep his enemies close and also keep them busy. If they're constantly having to go to the palace at Versailles to entertain him and to talk to him, there's really no way they can gather in support against him. And so he kind of leveraged his position and the favor that he could actually give these people, because ultimately, if they chose not to go, if they needed something from the king would say, I can't help you. So ultimately, if they didn't go, Louis XIV's never going to support them in anything that they ever want. Additionally, because he didn't really like the nobility that was already there, he sets up an entirely new class of nobles in order to kind of decline the power of who was called the sword nobles at the time. He sets up this new nobility class, the robe nobility, and he actually made people pay to become nobles. So these people weren't just being born into nobility anymore. It was, if you had enough money, which had to be a lot, you could actually purchase your way into this new noble class. But the problem here is all the nobles of this time were exempt from taxes. So that's going to really lead to some problems, because now you have more and more people in the population who don't have to pay taxes. And when the rich don't have to pay taxes, the tax burden falls on other people. And who are those other people? Well, they just happen to be the poor of that society. And because he has all this money coming in by having this new nobility class that's actually paying to be in, he never has to call on the Estates General, which was essentially a governing body that approved taxes, helped enact some legislation, and dealt with financial matters. He never had to deal with them. And in fact, in France, for about the next 150 or so years, they never actually used the Estates General. So he kind of starts this precedent because the nation's doing very well under him, and he's basically financing his own government. So pretty big, important part to know. What about the one law? Well, he sets up the Code Louis, which essentially standardized laws in all of France. Instead of having some laws in northern France and some laws in southern France, you had same laws for everyone in France. What about the one faith? Well, he's a very devout Catholic. He revokes the Edict of Nantes, which one of his ancestors put into place, because he only wants Catholicism in France. And he signs the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, which revoked the Edict of Nantes. And so, as a result, you're going to have a lot of Huguenots, again, French Protestants, who are going to immigrate out of, not all of them, but again, religious freedom becomes a big issue of this time period for the next couple hundred years, and then even today, obviously, but the North American colonies and everything in American history that you guys learn, again, it all stems from what was going on in Europe, including here under Louis XIV. These Protestants do not want to stick around because they don't really have much freedoms and they don't really have much toleration. But despite Louis XIV ruling under the divine right of kings and being a very staunch Catholic, he's not going to bow down to the Pope. He ascribes to something that's called Gallicanism, and that's essentially a dumbed down version, to put it simply, is where the Pope has no power over politics. Pope has no power over politics. So that's kind of what he ascribes to. And later on, some other kings, some other monarchs in that area are going to ascribe to the same thing, pretty much coming up with their own thought system. And then if you're interested in papal history, there's going to be a lot of popes who come along to try to rescind that idea and gain more and more power in the infallibility of the Pope. But Louis XIV's final words, "I am leaving you, but the state remains forever." So even though before he said, "I am the state," now he's going to be saying, well, even though I'm leaving, the state's going to remain forever. We've unified it. So did Louis XIV lead to the French Revolution? Well, it's debatable, but many people believe that he actually opened the door to all the happenings that went on in the French Revolution. And he did that in a couple different ways. Number one, he weakened the economy. Even though during his short term, even though he reigned for a while, we're talking about short-term success, under 100 years, the nation does very well and becomes a pretty powerful nation in Europe. Long-term, he's going to be weakening the economy without even realizing it. One of the ways he does that is by constantly waging war. He wanted to expand France's border, but that's going to require a lot of money poured into the military, because obviously if you want to keep going and expand into new lands, people are going to fight against you. And if people fight against you, you need more soldiers, you need more weapons, you need more food and supplies. So ultimately, you need more money. In addition to that, like I said before, he revoked the Edict of Nantes. So he's expelling and essentially kicking out a lot of the Huguenots, again, French Protestants. And that's a potential source of income. Those are potential members of society who are productive and adding to the economy that he's kicking out. Because even though they were the minority, there's still a lot of people. Number two, he led to potentially the French Revolution because of his tax plan that hurt the poor. Again, the nobles, the rich of the rich, did not have to pay taxes, so the tax burden fell on the poor. So, is there any accomplishments to him, though? Again, history is often debatable, so there's different interpretations over who's good and who's right, but generally speaking, you could think of these as his accomplishments. He does make France a power in Europe. He strengthens the royal power. He strengthens their army. He increases a lot of the arts and the economy. He also prevented inside rebellions against the nobility. Again, he kept them busy at Versailles, kept his enemies close, so to speak. And then Versailles also became a symbol of wealth and power during this time. And last but not least, the legacy that he leaves behind. Again, France is now in a powerful position in Europe. They are a powerful nation. But his plans and his efforts ultimately, long-term, didn't help the poor. And when you don't help the poor, it's going to lead to potential revolts and potential revolutions and a huge economic downturn in the nation. And ultimately, that's what leaves a crack in the door for the door to actually be open for the French Revolution. So again, like always, there's some helpful videos at the end. I'll make the Google Slides available for you. You can go ahead and see some of these videos. And then we also did a Lion King thing of interpreting the Lion King through this absolute monarchy lens.